Hi, everyone. Welcome to Asia Society Live. This is the first President's Forum in our remarkable series on the coronavirus and the role that Asia Society and the world are playing to fight to save lives in this. We are at war with this virus, and New York City, where Asia Society was founded 60 years ago, has already lost more people to coronavirus than in 9/11. One of the very few effective weapons to save lives in the coronavirus fight are ventilators. And today we're so honored to have the chair and CEO of Medtronic with us for a conversation, Omar Ishrak. Omar Ishrak is also a trustee of Asia Society and was involved with us early on when Governor Cuomo of New York called us to ask for help in sourcing life-saving goods from around the world to help save lives in New York, from personal protection equipment to ventilators. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But let me just talk a little bit about why Omar Ishrak has been a real leader in this fight against coronavirus. First of all, he's a passionate person, electrical engineer about medical devices. And when he was a student, born in Bangladesh, but he traveled across the US, hitchhiked to universities that had ultrasound equipment just to study these. And so just so you know, he's been in this for life. And he paired up as chair and CEO of Medtronic, a storied US company founded by two Americans in 1949 to repair medical equipment, and now one of the global leaders in fighting, in providing medical goods, life-saving medical goods around the world. What they've done in the past 5 weeks, 6 weeks, as this has hit the world so hard, first of all, ramping up production of ventilators. They were producing 150 a week in January. By June, they'll be doing 1,000 a week. That remarkable story of how you get factories coming online, producing more, even when your own employees are affected by coronavirus. Amazing story. Second, they decided to set the price at the lowest price that they had charged in markets. So pre-coronavirus. And so that act to say, we're not going to get additional profit out of this. We're going to price this at the lowest price that we've had is remarkable. Third, Omar Ishrak came to us early on with this question: how does he prioritize? It flooded with requests from around the world. How do we decide where these precious ventilators go and where the need is? And I think his efforts to try to understand how to prioritize those orders have been very important. Fourth is open source. They have opened the source of how their design specs for these ventilators, and now are partnering with unique partnerships such as Foxconn, which does the screens and the assembly of Apple iPhones at their factory in Wisconsin, I believe it is. The other thing I'd like to mention is unique partnerships. So Omar, we're gonna want you to talk about how you're partnering with Tesla, how you're partnering with Tata in India to try to ramp up and meet the needs of the world. And the last thing I want to mention is that Medtronic Foundation actually has announced it will double its match when employees now volunteer or donate money to their causes at this time of coronavirus. And that was a big step also. Omar Ishrak, we're really proud to have you here, and I welcome you. What's on your mind? I hear you got FDA approval for a ventilator that's been able to sell in 35 countries. And last night, finally, you got that approval. So things seem to be moving.
Yes. Well, first, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'll start off by saying is, we have done a lot, but we have a lot more to do. There's still, the death rates are still high. And thankfully, so far, at least in the US, ventilators have been available when needed, but we need to make sure that we have enough of them so that it is never of concern. So that's extremely important. And I also want to say that I don't know how long in this journey we are. We're prepared to do what it takes. And our mission in Medtronic has always been one of using technology to save lives. And in the end, that's all we're doing. This did not require me making some kind of plea to our employees or start some new initiative or anything like this. it was all a natural reaction by every employee of Medtronic, and I couldn't be prouder of them. And I'm just honored to be able to lead that company and be part of that. So, let me stop right there. I think, Josette, you gave a pretty good summary of what we've done and the sorts of things we still have to do. I mean, it's not June yet, so we still have a lot of work to do to get up to that 1,000. We're only at about, we're approaching 400 in April. So we're busy working that. I'm also spending a lot of personal time with the engineers in making sure that this open source platform gets to scale with some partners. I mean, there've been 70,000 downloads of this, so we obviously cannot work with all of them. But there are a few bigger partners of scale who have complementary supply chains with whom we're engaging, and the ventilators we make through them will actually be on top of this 1,000 a week that we're talking about in June. So. Maybe the final thing I'll say is that, we're aware that this hasn't really hit many of the Asian countries and African countries with large populations. And in those countries, they have far fewer ventilators than in the United States or in Western Europe. And so this open source initiative, we're looking to make sure that we do everything we can to serve those countries as well. And I think it'll be a critical asset if the need arises. Now, if the need doesn't arise, that's the best thing of all.
Well, Omar, one of the things I've appreciated is that Asia Society, when it was asked to help, we pulled out all the stops to help New York, to help California, to help countries in need around the world. We were founded 60 years ago in the ashes of World War II, with the idea that if there was conflict between the East and the West, lives would be lost in the future. And so we have centers all over the world, all over the United States, and we have activated our board. And you were part of an extraordinary meeting we had March 15th, where the governor of New York, Governor Cuomo, came on and spoke to our trustees and made an appeal. I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about that and the impact that it had in your world.
Yes, of course. The Governor Cuomo. That was one of the first sort of meetings with a group of leaders dedicated to this one subject. And that was, if you recall, Josette, the meeting had been pre-scheduled, but I'm sure none of us had planned the agenda the way it turned out. Mm-hmm. And Governor Cuomo came and spoke passionately about the need in New York, which. We knew about and we'd heard about, but hearing him say it directly with the sincerity and the passion that he had, obviously, it sort of struck many people. That too was the first time that I laid out publicly the need for appropriate allocation, and we were clearly struggling with it because, as the manufacturer of these things, we knew the challenge ahead of us if the numbers that were put out there were going to be met. And there was just no way in which we were going to come even close to those numbers by the time, the death rate started to climb or the seriousness of the issue started to climb in the United States. So, and around the world, because we were already facing issues in Europe, just the day before on the Friday before that meeting, I had a call with the Italian ambassador in the United States who was desperately asking for ventilators in Italy. And so we knew this was coming, but the number that Governor Cuomo had stated at that time was 30,000, and we weren't even close to that number. So I knew that, look, we aren't going to have enough. So what are we going to do? We'll have to take the ventilators we have and send them to the places of the greatest need. And one thing about this disease is that it appears to have peaks which move around like a weather map of some sort, where the storm kind of moves around. So if you can follow that, then we can make maximum use of the equipment that we had. So that was the first time we raised it, and since then, I think Liz Jennings and others in the Asia Society team worked with us in thinking through how do we in fact allocate, who do we contact, what models do we use? And, it's not perfect, but we do have a systematic mechanism today. And then I think that meeting triggered this whole thought process and gave it immediate acceleration. So I appreciate what the Asia Society has done and the visibility that it has gotten for that purpose. I think is very well deserved.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. And I will say that you mentioned Elizabeth Jennings, who is my chief of staff at Asia Society. Both Liz and I have a background in humanitarian supply chains. I used to head the United Nations World Food Program, which is the biggest humanitarian supply chain in the world, going into war zones and disaster zones. And Liz also has served in Pakistan and Haiti on the front lines of these supply chains. During the global food crisis in 2008, countries could not place orders for food. And those with the most cash and the biggest markets were able to, get all the food that was available in the world. And so you do see a triaging happening in the world during crises, and also a breakdown in supply chains, because many countries, many states in America, mayors don't know where to source these goods. I'd like to go through some of the key issues that we have discussed, and one issue that governors in the US face is where to buy these. Could you give us an estimate of the gap in supply? Because the demand is so huge. So how big is this competition for ventilators in the world? Do you have a sense of how many are estimated to be needed over the next few months?
Well, one thing that we're seeing is that, I think I mentioned earlier, is that although the required numbers that are stated out there are big, so far, at least in the United States, we've been able to manage with what we have. And I'm hoping that as our sort of production increases, we can keep pace. The immediate demands were large, very large. I mean, I threw a number of 30,000 out at that time. Remember, this was in March, and we were producing 300 a week, so that's like 1,200 a month. And so to get to 30,000 would take us, a year. So that obviously wasn't going to work. I think there's some perspective one has to put in the numbers that are put out there. Because there are different types of ventilators. There's the high-end ventilators, which are used, for the most critical patients, and those are the machines that we are most well known for and make. And these are fairly sophisticated. They, in fact, they do a lot of the function of the lung by itself, because the lung isn't really pushing oxygen into the bloodstream, which is what it's supposed to do, because it's full of fluid. And what the ventilator does is through forced air, sort of fights its way through the fluid and gets the oxygen to the blood. Now, the worse the patient is, the more has to be done. Now, there's more complications behind that, because there's issues of the lung collapsing during exhalation, and backward pressure has to be applied, and all of that. So it's a complicated system, which is adjusting on a real-time basis with how the patient is doing. And these are customized per patient. So those are the high-end ventilators where really, unfortunately, the COVID-19 condition kind of necessitates. Our clinical people, if they had no other restrictions, would put these patients on these high-end ventilators straight away. Now, there are other ventilators, which we call like mid-range or mid-acuity ventilators, which can be used as like step-down. When the patient is recovering, they still need a ventilator because, believe it or not, the lung is forgotten how to move. And so you need to kind of wean the patients off the ventilator. And these other ventilators are also in demand. And then beyond that, there are things called respirators, which are not intubated. In other words, the high and mid-acuity ventilators, a tube is put down inside the body, while the others, you essentially put a mask on and provide oxygen in a way in which it's automated. So if you put all that together, the numbers do get big. And in the end, we had to kind of do it in that way to get the appropriate need and to move the right machine to the right place. So I do think that as we've talked to different governors, because we've had calls with a lot of governors who are in desperate state, And we've talked them through this process and talked them through our allocation process, and they work with each other now, moving ventilators from place to place. I'm sort of guardedly optimistic that unless we see a real surprising spike in death rates, that we can somehow manage through this. So again, that's why I don't want to go into the exact numbers, because there's lots of numbers thrown out there, but the context is important, and understanding the next level of detail of which ventilator, where is it needed, when can you, do you have trained staff who can actually use it? I mean, the other thing that we've done is we've created this remote control capability where the staff a trained respiratory therapist can bring up the training of a ventilator remotely. So in some other state, because they can't travel that easily, and we only have that many.
Right.
Also, many of the caregivers can provide the support from outside the room without exposing themselves to risk. So, there's a lot of actions we're taking around the reality that we have, which is a big demand, and trying our very best to, while making more ventilators, use what we have in the most efficient way possible to save as many lives as possible. And our hope is, and our desire and goal is that no life is lost because a ventilator wasn't available.
That sounds like a very worthy goal. And I think we were all inspired when we saw that the governor, I believe it was of Oregon, was sending ventilators to New York because they didn't need them right then. And Governor Cuomo's pledge that if they had ventilators not being used in New York, they'd go to the rest of America. And that cooperation that we see happening with these vital equipment. Behind the scenes in this supply chain train wreck that's happened with this demand for all sorts of equipment that the world now is being talked about in every household, N95 masks, surgical masks, testing kits, all of this is a world that well. And I know well from my background, which is, these restrictions, export controls, import controls, medical approvals. And so medical equipment, medical supplies go through a very specific, very tight process, often taking years to be able to effectively market, some of these big core equipment. Could you talk a little bit about that and what the FDA announced last night?
No, I think the FDA has been in the forefront of this. They have a process called EUA, which is an emergency authorization that they can put in place if there's a crisis like this. And they've put that in place. And through that, for devices and products that are to do with this crisis, they have very speedy approval. And they're on it. They've laid requirements out. We know what they are, that here are the things that you need for rapid approval. And the FDA has been extremely responsive. I had a call with the head of the product division there, Jeff Sheeran, I think it was last Sunday. I called him and talked to him and look, this thing is coming. And he understood exactly what I was talking about, and we got the approval in, I think it was within a day. And it isn't that they aren't, you have to have some level of policing on this, because you don't want bad products to go out there. But the fact that we have a history with them, they know our capability, they know how we test it, obviously helps a lot. Like, for example, when I talked to him about the open sourcing, because that's going to come up later, where some other manufacturer will make it. Jeff's main first clear question to me is that, are you going to look at the quality and all of that? I said, yes, we would. And we would make sure that it's installed properly and provide training to physicians. And I said, well, then that's fine. We'll treat that as a contract manufacturer. So he was thinking live as to how to deal with these and what's the most efficient way to do it, not what's the, longest or most.
Sure.
So I do think the FDA has risen to the challenge here, and they're clearly working on this like we are, thinking about all these different things from their perspective.
Right. And that's happening, of course, across the globe, where countries have to come up to speed, right, on what equipment they're allowing in. And there's been a process on some of this of mutual recognition. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think, for example, with the N95 masks, the US is now mutually recognizing the standards, the masks that meet the standards for, countries in Europe or other places. Is this something that you see happening with some of your equipment that, would be helpful in this fight?
I think there's actually two aspects of the global supply chain. These products are made in one place, but their supply chain is from many different places. Like the ventilator we make, it's actually made in Ireland. It's exported from Ireland, but the key components are supplied from 14 countries, and they're everywhere. So if restrictions are put in, maybe unintentionally, of goods moving from one country to another, you'll obviously have supply problems. So we worked hard to make sure that there was no unintended law put in that created some kind of preferential treatment in one area to the degree that it started to affect the supply chain itself. So it was important to keep kind of talking about that and emphasizing that let's protect the supply chain, because it is global and that's just how it is, and most manufacturers have that. I think beyond that, in our situation, we've tried to, again, allocate between countries. We've tried to make a plea to the G20 to see if there could be this similar kind of allocation done across those countries. We've done the same thing at the EU. I think my colleague Jeff Martha, who's the incoming CEO, he had a call with the European Union where the same request was made. So by and large, people have followed that thought process, because it is pretty straightforward and logical when you think about it in a situation of short supply and in a crisis that everyone can relate to, in the sense that it has no boundaries as to who this thing can attack, where and who. And I think everyone recognizes that. And so people in general are working together. This is not the time to put blockages up here and there. These things are moving along. In our world, it's really the supply chain, the global supply chain is the thing that we have to protect. And after that, the appropriate allocation. That's how the global nature of this crisis has impacted us.
Mm-hmm. And I think, certainly I've heard that the world is greatly appreciating companies with a reputation for excellence, because, as you said, the difficulty now is there's a lot of, entrepreneurs around the world who are jumping in to make masks and, try to be helpful, try to meet market demands. And there's a lot of stuff moving on global markets right now that isn't up to standard.
Yes.
And so, this is always a problem, right? Of knockoffs or, manufacturing that misses the key element that can protect lives in a product. But would you have any advice to leaders on how to deal with that? One thing we've been trying to help and been helping through Liz Jennings and our team at Asia Society is to look at who are verified suppliers in places like China, who have a track record of really producing the high quality goods, to try to make sure that America's been able to connect in with those new supply chains that are saving lives.
Well, I think you highlight the issue well. That in this crisis, where there's well-intentioned efforts in a place where healthcare is involved and involves a patient who's in a very serious state, making a mistake there is going to have bad consequences. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that unintended mistakes aren't made. I'm not. The only advice that I would have is that our big learning, which has happened just on the fly, is that this crisis has created an environment where companies and organizations are crossing company boundaries, crossing country boundaries in a very seamless fashion, and getting to work together for the right purpose by trusting each other, that we're all in it to save lives. Right. And I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen in lots of examples we just talked about. I would suggest that governments, in the same way, go to experts, no matter what their affiliation is, whether they're a company, whether they're in the government, no matter where, go to real experts and try to make sure that as new products or new ideas are put in place, some measure of safety checks
Right.
are put in place without it becoming bureaucratic. So I do think that the way in which the FDA is doing it, where in the example that I gave, they sped up their own process, but they also trusted us, knowing that we have the expertise and we work with them, and typically there'll be more process around that. But in this situation, you've got to make some judgment calls, and you can't follow all the processes to the letter of the document, because if you do that, it'll just take too long. And so people have to use some judgment. That's one. And second is have to trust that everyone's in here with the right purpose, because the goal that we have in front of us, and the battle, if you like, that we have in front of us, is one that has no boundaries. And so we have to work in a way that our boundaries don't exist as well. And that's what I would suggest that regulatory authorities do. And I haven't dealt with all the regulatory authorities, but the ones that we have certainly taken that approach, and I think will. But it's one worth remembering. Those are the two extremes. You get, too much well-intentioned sort of effort going out there, which may have risks associated with it, and the other, and you've got to guard against that. And the other is if you follow, your normal process, it's all going to take too long, so it defeats the purpose. So you can have judgment and trust. That is in this process, and I think if you apply that appropriately, that's the best we can do.
Excellent. And we'll now open it to questions for anyone listening in who would like to send those, and we'll be taking questions. So please send those in, and we'll keep discussing. So Omar, I'd like to ask you about the countries that don't have cash to put down to fight Corona, that don't have the ability to do this. And we've talked a little bit about Bangladesh, the country where you were born. A lot of poverty, a lot of innovation, good science. It's a combination of all those things. But give us, some sense. I know that you're always checking in back on, and you have a great love for Bangladesh. And tell us what's happening there. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those countries and those places on earth that could really get left behind.
Well, let me first state that in this crisis, how much money we make is about number 2,000 on the priority list. So we don't even think about that. Right now, it's saving lives, and we will do whatever we can to get the right equipment to the right place to save lives. That's why we put out this fixed price for our high-end ventilator, lower than the prevailing price, and for other ventilators as well that we have. It's just that the high end and the low end don't cost the same, but still they're fixed, and they're lower than the prevailing price before the pandemic. And we did that not because people weren't willing to pay, but because we didn't want that to be an issue, or any kind of one even thinking 2 minutes about whether we're kind of selling this thing to the place who pays the most money. I mean, that is not in our consideration, and we just wanted to put that out there. So I think the intentions there are good, and so far, money has not been the problem here. It really is how do you get skill sets and technologies and capabilities out to the right place at the right time. That has been the issue. It isn't that, if we can order things if we had money. There's more orders out there than we can possibly fulfill, even from emerging countries. So that, at least right now, that's not the issue. Longer term, it may or may not be, I don't know, but we can take a look at that when the specifics arise. In terms of Bangladesh, I'm obviously far away, but I've got relatives there, and we've got a team there. Medtronic has a team there, and also in other emerging markets in India, and in places in Africa, and virtually in China, everywhere. In Bangladesh, I think thankfully it hasn't, the death rates at least haven't risen to that degree yet, and maybe it can be contained through all the social distancing measures and so on that have been put in place, which I think have been very, very thoughtful and hopefully effective. And I think the local entrepreneurs are also trying to create their own ventilators, and we're helping. We're helping one of them who is a company which is relatively big for Bangladesh, and they have some capability. And our engineers are helping them. We've got an engineering center in Hyderabad in India, and we're working with them from the United States, and then they're helping locally. Because here the actual engineers are in the company that's taking the open source. We don't need to do the design. What we need to do is answer questions, clarify, and help with the supply chain. That's what we do. And we're doing our best to help them. And I can say that they're working 24/7 and making decent progress. And they can probably make some ventilators out there, which will help a lot. So there's real energy around this. The same thing is true in India, where there's more scale. And like Tata is a bigger organization, and they're moving ahead quickly, and I'm sure there'll be crossover help as needed. And other countries too are coming up.
So Omar, we have questions pouring in here. So let's try to get to as many as possible.
Okay.
So Jessica Ma asks via YouTube, we're on many different channels here. She says, amazed with you and your team's support of ventilators on the principle of as needed access and affordability. Is there anything you would have done differently over the past weeks or months as you look back?
I don't know. I haven't had time to reflect on those things. We've done what we've done is followed the basic principle that saving lives is the most important priority, and nothing else counts. In the tactics of it, when I have time to reflect, there may well be things that we could have done better. My learning, though, has been that somehow the organization, our organization and others can come together in a unique way. And how that translates under normal circumstances is one that we would love to learn.
Right.
So if anything, it was not during the crisis, it's pre-crisis, we have done something better.
And there's a question about the post-crisis world too, but we'll put that aside for a moment because we have kind of urgent questions right now. Cooper Lund asks, these ventilators, the parts are produced in 13 different countries, and COVID has also disrupted the supply chains as workers cannot go into work and as things cannot flow as easily. Do you think this will impact companies to further think about how spread out their supply chains are? Has this been a problem, being able to ensure that those parts are coming in from all different places in the world?
Actually, that is an interesting question, and governments around the world, as to put these policies in, actually have been very, very good about allowing essential businesses to continue. And the definition of an essential business has been pretty broad, and not without some level of scrutiny, but essentially, if in doubt, if the sort of social distancing rules and sanitation rules were maintained, they were allowed to operate in all countries, starting from China back in January and February, where our factories were shut during the Lunar New Year, which they would be shut anyway. But I think just a week after that, they started to produce parts because they were needed. At that time, of course, there were parts being made for countries around the world for other diseases. Heart attacks don't stop, stroke doesn't stop, and you still need factories running for that. So governments in general, I think more than in general, I think almost everyone, I haven't even heard of a single situation so far where we haven't been able to produce a part because the government has said, you can't go to work. And if such a situation has arisen and we've appealed, that has been listened to in a very rapid fashion. So fortunately, that has not been an issue. I think we got to think through about the global supply chain. I think more than saying we cannot have a global supply chain, because that does have its own benefits. I think more important than that is thinking about duplication and backups. And we do have, I mean, companies and corporations do have things called enterprise risk management and so on, where you go through and you create scenarios and you build alternatives. But I think this crisis has heightened our common desire to make sure that we never get disrupted by this. So I think building up multiple alternatives, duplicate supply chains are really the way to think about it, as opposed to put it in one country, because you don't know what crisis will be, and sometimes need may be required that certain things may be broken in a certain country, and you need the extra global capacity. So
we have a question.
It's impossible to predict. Yeah. Go ahead, Josette. Yeah.
No. We have many questions, but we have a question from Terry Ong, who asks, Bill Gates sort of predicted this pandemic. As the biggest manufacturer of medical equipment, shouldn't production capacity be planned more in advance?
Well, I think, we just, that's just, in many ways, to produce at that level, at the scale that we've never, ever seen. I mean, let's go back to the numbers. Just for us, it was 100 in January, 150 actually in January, and then it's 1,000 in June. That's a factor of 10. And if we run all our operations and that doesn't meet the whole demand, if you just take it in a way that you just listen to everybody. If you operate all our factories at 10 times their actual need all the time, I mean, it's not practical. And what are we going to do with all this stuff? Where's it going to go? So I think the responsiveness is actually more important. It is really important. I know there's a lot of reflection on this and what we can do better, but let's all recognize the fact that this is an unprecedented human challenge. It really is unprecedented. This doesn't happen every 10 years. It happens maybe 100 years. And the world is so different between 100 years apart. And it's an unprecedented challenge, and it therefore requires an unprecedented response. We can take learnings from it, but to create a whole infrastructure that sort of assumes that this kind of thing is the norm. There may be a different norm, but this kind of sort of volume and reaction is a norm is probably not practical. And so that's what I would say. I think the responsiveness and speed, duplication and ability to deal with the unforeseen is more important than just building up, sort of excess capacity everywhere, because you don't know where the problem is going to be.
Right. The VPL channel with the amazing Kika Hanazawa of Fashion Girls for Humanity asks this question, really appreciating this idea of open source during this crisis. And I think you address this a bit, but how do you ensure that products going out, I guess, under the name of Medtronic, produced by factories you haven't worked with, meet the specs, and how do you get that kind of feedback in this very complicated world we're in right now?
Well, first, the open source initiative does not require anyone to use Medtronic's name or anything like that. All the open source does is it releases in public all our documents to do with the specification of the product. Everything from the mechanical to the electrical, the software to what the parts are.
Was that a hard decision? Isn't this your proprietary information?
Yeah, but look, I go back to the challenge that we were facing. The mission of this company is to use technology to save lives. And if I just make it as black and white as that, and I look at the challenge that was facing us, that there are more lives that have been lost, and we have technology. What's the quickest way to get this technology to save lives? Well, get more people to use it and work it. So in many ways, it's something that we haven't done before, and it isn't a norm, but it wasn't a difficult decision. Once one of our leaders actually came up with the idea, I can't even remember a debate about it. It was more, how do we put it in place, rather than should we do it. That wasn't maybe a 1 second discussion on that. The rest of it is how we do it.
Well,
but
so
if I
vital,
go back to
because this allows for entrepreneurial companies. That we have a question also from Yoshe Ito asking, do you think car companies are prepared to step up and produce ventilators also? And how long will it take to see this kind of World War II response where, you know, we have factories retooling to meet the demand?
Well, I've actually been impressed by the capability. The ventilator happens to be a product which has lots of mechanical parts, and car companies do have a lot of the basic capacity to do that. And more importantly, actually, they have a complementary supply chain where they go after similar mechanical parts for a different purpose. But you know, a valve is used in a car, and it's also used in a ventilator. It's a different kind of valve and all of that, but there's a supplier for valve. And then that takes me to the Tesla sort of example, where actually through SpaceX, Tesla is a real expert in making this very specific valve, which is a very sophisticated device. It's a solenoid valve, and we have a single source in Ireland where they make this thing with a great deal of precision. And we're trying to scale them up, but here comes Tesla, and they have, through SpaceX, a real expertise in making these valves. So they are going to scale it up, and eventually, you know, that valve may in fact be better in some ways, eventually, because you don't want to change things when you first produce them. But that expertise will help it make it better in the longer run. So I do think that that car companies have this, but let's not confuse the ability to make something with the quality system that's required, with the training that's required in the field. I mean, those things a generic company will not have. And that's where we will support. These things will not be, by the way, also necessarily put into the market under Medtronic's name. The open source requirement does not require that. The open source requirement, you know, people can do what they want. However, if we are partnering with any such company, we obviously can't do it with all of them. Like I mentioned earlier, they're like, you know, every day the number goes up, but the latest count was there are 90,000 downloads. So clearly, you know, we can't work with all of them. But the ones we work with, we will certainly do everything we can, independent of whose name it is and all that stuff, to make sure these products are safe with the resources that we have. I think that's working together, we can actually use our strengths to get to the right place.
We have a question from Christine Davies, the founder of Polygauge. Medtronic's a major company, and also you are chair of Intel. And so you have a bird's eye view as to how this is hitting the US economy. Is this unlike anything you've ever seen? Where is it hitting hard? What do you expect that to look like? What are your predictions for the companies where you play such a vital role on how to manage this disruption?
Well, you know, first, you know, the other thing that we have done actually is also Intel has rallied around this crisis and got their own technology to apply in many ways, all the way from the disease prediction models to actually helping Medtronic in unique ways to you know, upgrade some of our products and things that had parts that were old, because these products had to be refreshed actually for this crisis. They're helping us in redesigning those parts. And again, there too, there's a sense of focus around saving lives and coming together to do it. So there is a sense that beyond, you know, their mission obviously isn't like Medtronic's, which is a healthcare company, but still the need to participate and contribute in any way possible with their skill set is clearly there, without a question. And it's been a real asset to have them work with our engineers, the Medtronic engineers, in doing some of these things. I think the broader economic question, I mean, clearly this is going to have an impact. You know, we look at it in like three phases. We've got a lockdown phase, which is right now, and how people are sort of functioning in this phase, and it varies depending on what industry you're in. If you're in the industry where you use PCs, you know, there's probably more PCs, high-end PCs being sold today than before, or in remote connections and all of that. Or so that part of the economy is probably going to be okay. If you're in the restaurant business or tourism and all of that, it's obviously going to be, it is very difficult right now. So, and the healthcare business, it's areas that have got huge demand, other areas which are slower, and there are diseases which will affect people no matter what's going on. Like I said earlier, strokes and heart disease and so on. So during the lockdown phase is one phase, and then there's a recovery phase. And based on what happened in the lockdown phase, you'll have to see how the recovery phase evolves. And we're planning for that and thinking that through, and I'm sure many companies are. And then there's a stable phase will have different dimensions in our view. This thing, people may make changes during the lockdown and recovery phase, which they may decide creates a new normal. And so things might well differ. So, I don't have a specific answer because I don't think anyone does, but that's the way in which we're thinking about it. There's a lockdown, there's a recovery, and there's a new normal. And how do we in our own industries adapt to that? And by industry, it's going to be fairly different.
The new normal obviously will affect everybody, and many questions about, what that world will look like and how all of our institutions will function and our communities and our individual families. And so that shift, one of the big shifts is bringing the world of public health into every home in the world.
That's
There's
right.
not one community not asking, how do I sanitize my hands? How do germs move? How do they enter your body? What equipment is needed? And as the head of Medtronic, and also in my past roles with the World Food Program, or even now I'm the special envoy for Haiti for $1 a year, but I've been specifically, we just ended an epidemic of cholera in Haiti. And so if people live through these epidemics, as many countries have, whether it's with Ebola or different kinds, different equipment's needed and different things are needed. But you must be quite amazed that the world, there's probably not a household in the world that hasn't heard the word ventilators.
That's right.
So what does this mean for your industry? The epidemiologist in our household is just, in some ways amazed that they never dreamed in their lifetime the world would wake up to these basic principles of public health and the importance of public health supply chains and coordination agencies, all of this. The WHO, who had heard of all of these different entities and players and products.
Well, I think healthcare is fairly broad and it's got different dimensions. Depending on the disease, there are infectious, and then there's the non-communicable ones as well, which are chronic disease, and all of those in the end take lives. And I think our common desire has to be to save and extend people's lives, no matter what state you're in, and whether there's a crisis or no crisis. So that's important. And we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we globalize healthcare and the quality of healthcare, and make sure that when there's treatments available in a certain country, that other countries also get the benefit of that treatment. And we've learned that awareness is extremely important, especially in emerging markets. There's a big disparity, as we all know, in the healthcare capacity, delivery capacity between emerging markets and developed countries. Awareness is a big issue. Training of physicians is an issue. Creation of infrastructure is an issue. And we've thought about that. We've been working on this for years, for maybe a decade or so. And we've learned a lot how to do this. But the ventilator example actually is a very interesting one. And I was telling this to our own team that, overnight, the awareness issue with ventilators has been resolved. Okay, every country in the world knows that they need a ventilator. And by the way, emerging countries are highly under-resourced, highly under-resourced. I mean, there's hundreds of ventilators in a major country like India, maybe 1,000, with 1 billion people. And so, and in Bangladesh, and I don't know how many there are, there's probably 100 ventilators. And in a country with 170 million people. So, the awareness that that's a need is going to be there. The open sourcing has allowed us to have broad spread innovation. And again, that happened because of a crisis situation. But it has created, in our own wave in the ventilator world, a new normal. That's a different one. That here suddenly my awareness problem has gone away. My innovation problem has gone away. Now I need to train them. And I need to, let's get, if at the very least we get, ICUs around the world that are well resourced with affordable ventilators, which they know how to use. And so if this kind of crisis happens, at least that will not be an issue. I'm sure there'll be other things which we haven't thought about. But I think that's, in many ways, that's a good way to kind of think about it, that what are our learnings from here? Because the global health challenge is an ongoing challenge of equalizing the availability of healthcare around the world. Is not something that you take one action and you resolve. It's one that we keep doing always. And,
well, certainly, in my work with Haiti, I mean, countries don't know what to do. A box arrives with a ventilator in it.
Right.
What do you do? And you don't have trained people, and you don't even have hospitals with consistent electricity.
Yes.
And so now, right, in real time, this tragedy is unfolding around the world with, and just the fact that you're on it and adapting and looking at ways you can do virtual learning. I'd like to ask you about that whole world, and we have, let me do two things here, because Ijaz Ahmed, who's a great Asia 21 leader, asked the question, how will countries who don't have the fiscal space flatten this curve? And also, what about in Southeast Asia, for example, where so much of work is day labor and people can't lock down in homes, they can't afford to literally eat the next day. We've seen a new study come out saying if you're hungry already in the world, this is going to exponentially compound this problem.
Yeah, well, that is obviously a challenge, and certainly those of us who've lived in those countries and know how those economies work, and there's an underground economy which where there's laborers and people who are doing daily work, and in a shutdown that just goes to zero, and these people have to be fed. And I think I do think that this is clearly governments have to do what they can, but individuals in those countries have to reach out and contribute in every way they can. People with the capacity, and it's money to some degree, but it's also making these kitchens available and all of that, and going out of your way. This is the time where if you want to help others and give charity, this charity will count. This has got a one-to-one impact of saving a life. This is not going to some organization who then decides where to put it and all that stuff. This is a direct help for people in front of you where the need is obvious. And so I think the world has to come together, and countries have to come together. And I think governments are actually doing all they can. They've all taken the decision by and large to put these rules in place, the lockdown in place, because knowing the potential economic consequences, but the alternative is worse, where people will die at large scale, which you just cannot have. And so the lockdown, I think, had to happen. And but that creates this economic problem, and also it's a real problem of food distribution and all of those things. So I think everyone working together, having that goal in mind, that not only do people not die because of COVID, people don't die because of other things, the consequence of the other actions that we've taken to prevent COVID. I mean, that's not going to help a lot if you save it in one area and create a problem somewhere else. So I think this crisis mentality has to extend to that too, that I cannot let poor people in one country just die. And what do we do quickly, crossing boundaries of class and society and all of that, and government and private, to try to address that the same way in which we're addressing COVID. and we
And
shouldn't
of
leave that
course,
behind.
those needs in America are profound too. We have
Yes,
so many workers who really are dependent day to day on
yes,
hourly wage, and our public hospitals.
yeah,
Governor Cuomo and others are really making a huge effort to make sure that private hospitals don't have the equipment that public hospitals don't have. So I think this issue, is, front and center here. Omar, we have to wrap up here soon. I'm going to ask a final question, which is, what is it like to be a major CEO, a major chairman of two storied, famed companies, Intel and Medtronic, and to run everything from your home office? We're seeing each other's homes, we're seeing each other's pets, children, all of this. Has this brought the world closer? How is that functioning? But I want to wrap up on my end saying that Asia Society has, pulled out every stop to be able to be helpful in this. And our connections through our centers in Hong Kong and China and Japan and Korea and Australia and India and around the world have really helped us be able to help those, such as Governor Cuomo and Governor Newsom in California and others who have asked for our help. And so we've been able to bring in millions of supply in help and support to this. And we're proud to do that. We're really proud of our, and honored to be able to play a role that I think was part of the original vision of this institution, to bridge between America and the world in times of trouble. And you're one of our great trustees, so we thank you. But leave us on a personal note, and we'll wrap up with that.
well, first, thank you, Josette, and thank you for your leadership and the leadership of the Asia Society, and really fulfilling, the role that it was designed to operate in, and really all the things you said I couldn't second more. And it's actually, amongst other things, it's been a real honor and a privilege, and I've highly enjoyed being part of the Asia Society Board of Trustees, and made lots of friends and learned a lot. And I think together the Asia Society is making a real difference. I think to your question about how we're operating in this environment, look, the crisis is so big, you don't worry about those things. And in fact, it really has shown that the video and all of these things actually work reasonably well. They're getting better all the time. I don't want to minimize, though. I mean, at some point, you do need to see people face to face, and hopefully we'll get that done. But in the meantime, we're operating just fine. I think that crisis is the overwhelming issue here, and how we react to it. How do we keep our employees safe? How do we save other people's lives? And in the end, how do we come out of this in a way that we're stronger in some way as an organization and as a company? And if we can all aim to do that, I think we'll all be better off. So again, not a very specific answer to that question, but I do think that the remote stuff is working for now, but I don't want this to be forever, although there'll probably be more of it. And let's get out of this thing better than we started, and learn a lot from it, and see how we can take lessons from the work that we're doing into our day-to-day work when this crisis is over. So I want to thank you, Josette, for arranging this, and it's been a real pleasure talking to you and answering all the questions. And we'll do our very best to help others, and that's the mission of this company, and we're dedicated to it. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Omar, and to all of our listeners and all of the broader Asia Society family and everyone joining us on social media. Our heart goes out to you. You've seen a corporate leader who has a heart here, who has been thinking about humanity, who got into this business because of his passion for the medical field, hitchhiked across America to go talk to any experts he could find on medical equipment. This is your moment, Omar. You've been a great leader at this time, and we're honored to partner with you. And during this week of Passover, during this week of Easter, our hearts go out to every family in the world, and we stand together. And join us at asiasociety.com if you want to be part of our conversation, of our leadership, from the highest level diplomacy to the factory floor, trying to make a difference in coronavirus. Thank you. We're signing off. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.